Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and it is my privilege to be your haunted host for this episode. It's a deeply cold and dark wintry night. Periodic gusts of wind pick up the ice and snow on the ground, gently pattering against the window panes of a modest two-story house, set back and isolated along a stretch of rural highway surrounded by woods. Although the lights are still on and the curtains are wide open, everyone inside the home appears to be asleep. A Christmas tree is up, with colorful lights and decorations bringing joy to the quiet and quaint interior. New toys are scattered about, signs that some children recently had been playing with them until the late hours of the night. It's a typical scene from nearly every Christmas tale, the warmth of a loving family keeping a home bright and cheery even as the wintry wind whips outside. A shrill ringing interrupts the still hominess of the scene. A middle-aged woman rises out of her bed, walks out of her bedroom in her nightgown, and picks up the receiver, finally silencing the persistent shriek. On the other end, she hears laughter and glasses clinking. A party, perhaps? It's Christmas, after all. The boisterous background noise contrasts with the serenity of her own surroundings, so still and quiet. She then hears a woman on the line, and she's asking to speak with someone. Confused, the weary middle-aged woman, just recently roused from sleep, informs the caller that no one by that name lives there. She must have the wrong number. She stays on the line for another beat, just a little longer, hearing what was later described as a weird and eerie laugh from the other end. And then, the phone goes dead. What initially seemed like an innocent wrong number soon became linked with one of the most enduring holiday mysteries, an ominous foreshadowing of a family's tragic fate and their never-ending search for answers. On today's episode, we explore a mystery that continues to baffle true crime sleuths. A holiday tragedy that is everyone's worst nightmare, coupled with a barrage of endless, unanswered questions. In a story with so many strange coincidences and seemingly disconnected details, nothing quite makes sense. Did a terrible crime happen in a small town on Christmas 1945, and the resounding calls for justice have gone unanswered until now? Or did a simply tragic event occur, and the truth has been there, plain as day, all along? But before we get to that, from all of us at Haunted Talks, the Haunted Walk team, and myself, we want to wish you a very happy Haunted Holidays. Thank you so much for tuning in throughout the year, supporting the show, and joining us on our ghost tours and paranormal adventures. We can't do what we love without you. We'll be taking a short break, but don't worry, we'll be back with brand new episodes of Haunted Talks in late January. In the meantime, if you're looking for a way to get out of the house during the holidays, or perhaps escape the house and leave those guests behind for a few hours, we have got you covered. In Ottawa, check out the original Haunted Walk and Secrets of the Chateau Laurier, both running on select dates through December. In Toronto, you can join the original Haunted Walk or dare to try our Alone in the Dark experience at the Village at Black Creek. Our Kingston guides are nestled all snug in their beds, resting up for their return in February. For tickets and schedules, visit hauntedwalk.com. If you're still hunting for a last-minute gift idea or spooky stocking stuffer, check out our Haunted Walk gift certificates. They are available for all of our experiences, and you can pick one up for yourself or anyone else at any time at hauntedwalk.com/giftcards. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. We're at Haunted Walk to stay connected with all things spooky this holiday season. Finally, please take a moment to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen. Your support helps others discover us, and it really means the world to us. A special shout out to Jeter A, who recently left a wonderful review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much. We love hearing what our listeners think about the show. Let's rewind our story and introduce the main characters, the Sodder family. George and Jeannie Sodder had 10 children, 9 of whom were still living at home in 1945 when our mystery begins. The family was living in Fayetteville, West Virginia, a small community quite isolated in the forested hills of the state. George ran a successful business, helping to support and supply the local coal mines, the economic and social backbone of the community. The Sodders had settled in Fayetteville in the early 1920s and were a very respected middle-class family that was known for their hard work and dedication. George was born in Italy and had close ties with the Italian community in central West Virginia. But he had his fair share of enemies as well, something we'll be exploring a little later. Like many people in their community, the Sodder family spent Christmas Eve 1945 in the comforts of their 2-story house. Marion, the eldest daughter, had surprised her sisters by bringing home some new toys from the store where she worked. The 3 middle girls, Martha, Jeannie, and Betty, were anxious to stay up past their bedtime and play just a little bit longer. Their mother, Jeannie, agreed to the request as long as everyone completed their chores before heading off to bed. The 2 middle boys, Patrick and Louis, were also permitted to stay up and enjoy the evening with their sisters. The youngest, Sylvia, and the 3 older children, Marion, John, and George, were all asleep by 10 p.m. If you're keeping track, that means that the parents and 4 older children were asleep, while 5 children remained awake. And then there was the phone call, the strange wrong number, ending with that eerie woman's laugh that we used to open the episode. Jeannie Sodder answered the phone at about 12:30 a.m. The house was quiet, and she assumed that everyone was now asleep, with the middle children finally tired out from the day's festivities. But Jeannie didn't actually check on the children. She only saw her eldest daughter asleep on the couch. Strangely, the curtains had been left open, and all of the lights were still on. That was a chore that was supposed to be completed before bed, and the children had seemingly forgotten. Jeannie was mildly annoyed. That was their deal. To be permitted to stay up a little later than normal, they had to finish their chores. But she was also a bit perplexed, as the children were generally very responsible and obedient. Since she didn't hear them playing, she assumed they must have been so tired they had forgotten. Weary herself, Jeannie decided to leave the lights on and the curtains open, a fateful decision that probably saved lives. Jeannie returned to bed, but was awoken a second time, about half an hour later. This time, she described a sound, like a heavy object hitting the roof and gently rolling down the slope. Thinking nothing further of the odd noise, she drifted off again. The third time she was awoken, the situation was much more urgent. The smell of rancid smoke filled the air, and clouds of dark soot were starting to pour into the bedroom. Jeannie noticed that a room George used as his office was ablaze, with flames surrounding the electric and telephone boxes. She quickly woke up her husband, picked up baby Sylvia, and raced downstairs, aided by the lights that had been left on. Marion, who had been sleeping in the living room close to the door, was able to escape, and the two older sons, who were in the attic, exited through a window. Regrouping outside, the family noticed that 5 children were missing. Martha, Jeannie, Betty, Patrick, and Louis. The same 5 children that had been permitted to stay up late. By now, the flames were raging, licking the dry wood walls, and it was impossible to go through the front door of the house to try to retrieve the missing children, who presumably were stuck on the upper floor. George frantically looked for a ladder that he normally kept propped near the house, but it was nowhere to be found. He also attempted to scale the side of the house in his bare feet, to no avail. Next, George and his sons desperately tried to back one of his trucks up against the house, hoping to reach the second floor by climbing on the truck bed. But strangely, neither truck would start. They were both completely dead. The work trucks had worked perfectly fine the day before, but were now both ominously silent. The family tried pouring water on the fire, but the cold temperatures had frozen the buckets completely solid. When the family ran out of the burning house, they noticed that the phone lines weren't working. A phone repairman later told them that the lines were cut, not singed. To cut the line, someone had to be willing to climb 14 feet into the air. A man whom neighbors had seen stealing a block and tackle, or set of pulleys, from the property around the time of the fire was identified and arrested. He admitted to the theft and claimed he had been the one to cut the phone line, thinking it was a power line, but denied having anything to do with the fire. Why he would want to cut any utility lines to the Sodder house while stealing the block and tackle has never been explained. Marion raced to a neighbor's house and frantically woke them up, urging them to call the fire department. Although authorities were informed of the fire shortly after the Sodder family escaped the burning house, getting help would prove to be a complicated matter. This was a remote part of West Virginia on Christmas Eve. It was 1945, and most of the able-bodied men who served as firefighters were off fighting in the Second World War, or deep in the coal mines providing supplies for the war effort. The fire department relied on an inadequate phone tag system and poor training. The fire chief, who had heard about the fire early on, couldn't attend to the scene because he was unable to drive the fire engine. A relative of the Sodders, who happened to be a firefighter, rushed to the house, but without equipment. He, like the family, was powerless to put out the blaze. The Sodders were left alone, in the freezing cold night air, with nothing to do but watch their house burn to the ground. When help did arrive, hours later, there was nothing left except a smoldering pile of ash and 6 remaining family members standing outside in disbelief. It was initially assumed by the authorities and community members that the 5 missing children tragically perished in the fire, unable to escape the spreading flames. But the family had immediate doubts. They said they hadn't heard any screams for help as they desperately tried to access the upper floors. The boys who escaped through the attic window didn't check on their siblings, but were certain the other children would have escaped the same way they did. The fire had spread quickly, but there were various escape routes for the children. The lights were all on and provided critical illumination in the dark. As everyone congregated outside, Jeannie Sodder recalled the strange events from the hours immediately before the fire. That really odd telephone call with the woman laughing before hanging up. The sound of something hitting the roof and then rolling down the slope. The chores that had gone unfinished despite the children normally being very obedient. George added to the list of unexplained things the missing ladder, which was always propped against the house, the 2 trucks that refused to start, the phone line that was cut, and later, a green rubber ball that he said resembled a type of explosive or grenade. As Fire Chief Morris began poking around what remained of the Sodder home, he started to think that the Sodders may be right, that this was no ordinary house fire. For Chief Morris, and for others in the years to come, the most mysterious thing about the whole incident was the lack of bones. 5 children supposedly died in the fire, but there wasn't a single trace of human bones found in the rubble. When you add this to the lack of children's screams heard during the fire, the fire chief and family started to wonder if the 5 missing children had even been in the house when the fire started. After thoroughly searching the surrounding woods and neighbors' properties, it became clear there was absolutely no trace of the 5 middle Sodder children, Martha, Jeannie, Betty, Patrick, and Louis, had completely vanished. And from that moment, the Sodder family began their unrelenting quest for truth and justice for their children. The fire chief eventually sided with other authorities and a jury who deemed the fire accidental and issued death certificates for the 5 children. But the facts of the case were analyzed and reanalyzed countless times over the years, with each commentator adding their own interpretation, starting with the cause of the fire. The initial investigation speculated that the fire was caused by an electrical issue. Jeannie had reported seeing fire surrounding the electrical box in her husband's office, and in the 1940s, it was one of the most common causes of residential fires. However, the Sodders also had reported that the electricity was on when they ran out of the house. They distinctly remembered all the lights still shining brightly when they initially escaped. In fact, the lights had probably saved their lives, allowing them to navigate through the thick, black smoke. It was only after the fire became more intense that the electricity was affected and that the house went dark. Most believe that an electrical fire would have caused the lights to go out immediately. There's something else going on. More people gravitated towards arson as being the cause of the fire. Jeannie had reported hearing the distinctive sound of something hitting the roof and rolling down the slope only a half hour before the inferno was raging inside. Jeannie wasn't alone. A bus driver passing through the area later reported seeing what he described as balls of fire being thrown at the house sometime after midnight. The Sodders claim that the fire was most intense in the attic and upstairs, perhaps indicating that it could have started on the roof, not the ground floor, as was posited by the investigation. Arson could also explain the misplaced ladder, which was later found discarded down an embankment on the property. Perhaps someone had used it to assist them in starting the fire. Maybe that sinister phone call was actually a sick prank by the arsonist, a tactic to ominously laugh at the victims before they were left to their fate. As the arson theory gained traction, people began wondering if there was an even more terrible reason for the fire. Perhaps someone was trying to cover up or distract authorities from another serious crime. George Sodder definitely had enemies in the community. Although he was well respected by business associates and most neighbors, he never shied away from speaking his mind. He previously voiced strong opinions about Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of his birth country, Italy. During the 1930s and early 1940s, the Italian-American community was quite split on their opinion of Mussolini, with plenty offering support for the dictator, and especially his message of a stronger and more unified Italy. George Sodder did not agree, and his vocal opposition to Mussolini and pride that his son was off fighting fascism in Europe ruffled plenty of feathers. It may initially seem far-fetched that the Italian mafia was responsible for a house fire and the disappearance of 5 children in a small town in West Virginia. But there was some compelling evidence that added weight to the theory. For years, George had reported receiving threats from the mafia, and it was well documented by the authorities and witnessed by his neighbors. The property had been vandalized before, and thefts were reported to the police. His sons had also seen strange vehicles in town in the months before the fire, with some supposedly tailing the younger children and following them to school. Perhaps the children were the target all along, and the arson was a convenient way to either cover it up or murder the remaining family members. Kidnapping children and holding them for ransom, or squirreling them away as punishment for their parents, weren't uncommon tactics for the mafia in the 1940s, and there was speculation that some of George's old Sicilian connections had come to America to make him pay. People even considered if some of his family members back in Italy, who he was strangely tight-lipped about, had arranged to have the younger children brought overseas to raise them within the Sicilian mafia's fold. George had his own theory that some of the town's officials had been paid off by the mafia to stay quiet and not investigate the disappearance of his children. And it was clear that individual opinions may have influenced the verdict. It was later discovered that one of the jury members who declared the fire accidental had been a vocal supporter of Mussolini, which led to a bit of an ongoing feud with George Sodder. Additional fuel was added to the kidnap theory when possible sightings of the children began pouring in. A neighbor who personally knew the Sodder children claimed she saw them inside a parked vehicle on the side of the road while the fire was burning. Another woman at a car rest stop just past Fayetteville claimed she had served a group of people breakfast the next morning, and they had 5 children of approximately the right age with them, who were strangely silent during the whole meal. Although she didn't personally know the Sodder children, after seeing their photographs, she was convinced it was them. A new theory began to emerge that perhaps the 5 children who opted to stay up late that fateful Christmas Eve night were lured away from the house. They never finished their chores and never made it to bed. Instead, they were bundled into a car while someone else set fire to the home. For the Sodder parents, this meant their children could still be alive somewhere. The Sodders continued on their quest for answers by trying to raise public awareness, hiring private investigators, and pushing authorities to look into the case again. Overcome with profound grief, George Sodder backfilled what remained of the house only 4 days after the fire. It was still a smoldering pile of ash and had yielded no bones. At that point, he was quite sure that his children had perished, and he was intent on making a memorial garden on the site. However, as more questions began to emerge, and the Sodders became more convinced their children could still be alive, he agreed to have the site re-excavated and re-examined by new experts. A pathologist from Washington, D.C. arrived on the scene in 1949 and painstakingly combed through the debris that was now mixed with dirt fill. Like Chief Morris, the pathologist found no trace of burnt human bones. Even crematoriums couldn't burn bodies this effectively. It was a mystery, but state authorities, including the governor of West Virginia, felt there was nothing further to investigate, and they officially dropped the case in 1950. The FBI followed suit a couple of years later, and officially at least, the Sodder case was closed. For the next decades, the Sodders continued to chase lead after lead. They erected a billboard next to the main highway in Fayetteville with photos of their missing children and a desperate plea for witnesses to come forward. It questioned if the children were murdered, kidnapped, or perhaps alive and well somewhere else. The billboard remained on the site, becoming a landmark of the community until it finally faded beyond recognition. Dilapidated and illegible, the family finally took it down in 1989. The Sodders worked hard to keep their family's case in the spotlight and traced down countless leads, even as they became elderly and impoverished by the ordeal. They traveled throughout West Virginia, raising awareness, and their efforts uncovered additional witnesses that may have seen the children shortly after the fire. But the tips all eventually led nowhere. The most promising lead arrived in their mailbox in 1967, over 20 years after the fire. It was a single photograph with some cryptic writing on the back. According to the label, the photo was supposedly of Louis Sodder, one of the boys who would have been in his 30s by now. To Jeannie, it looked remarkably like her son. It was postmarked from Central City, Kentucky, and although the Sodders traveled to the location, they couldn't find any trace of the sender, and no one knew the man in the photograph. Jeannie remained convinced it was a credible lead, and the photograph could show that her son had made it out alive. She even framed the photo and placed it on her mantle, another shred of hope that her children could someday return. The Sodder family never quit searching for the missing children until their dying day. George Sodder died seemingly exhausted in 1969, 24 years after the night that changed his life forever. Jeannie survived for a couple of more decades, wearing black as a sign of her mourning for her children and husband, constantly tending to the memorial garden at the site of their burned home. All but one of the surviving children continued the quest for the truth. But eventually, they all passed away too. The last surviving Sodder child, Sylvia, died in 2021. So what happened to the Sodder children? There is no shortage of theories. But regardless which strand you follow, no single theory makes complete sense, and there are gaping holes in every possibility. The most plausible answer is that the children perished in the fire, and that they've been dead since Christmas Day, 1945. Although it's highly suspicious that two investigators were unable to find traces of bones, it's still possible they were burned beyond recognition. Fire investigation was not the same in 1945 as it is today, and even an experienced pathologist could have missed a shred of evidence. Although the house was primarily made of wood, there was a good store of coal that could have added heat to the fire, reaching levels of destruction not normally seen in residential blazes. It also smoldered for hours, while the family waited for the fire department to arrive, burning longer and likely hotter than a typical house fire. The heavy weight of the house collapsing on the children's bodies could have also crushed the bones into small, unrecognizable pieces, and the backfill may have decomposed the remnants faster than normal. However, the lack of bones is just one part of this confusing mystery. The cause of the fire is probably the root of the mystery in this case. There are only two possible causes. The first, that it was accidental, likely caused by an electrical short, or the second, it was arson, a fire that was deliberately set for unknown reasons. There's plenty to dispute about the electrical short theory, notably the electricity remaining on when the fire broke out, as well as George's assurance that the house had been rewired with new technology only a year prior. On the other side, there is plenty to bolster the arson theory. The thump and rolling sound heard by Jeannie, the fireballs witnessed by the bus driver, the weird green rubber ball found days later, the cut telephone line, the misplaced ladder. If we accept that the fire was an intentional act, it's not much of a stretch to believe that a kidnapping or murder could have occurred as well. And that would not be unprecedented, as fires are sometimes set to hide other crimes, usually murder or assault or kidnapping. Some have wondered if the middle children were already dead when the fire started, and the blaze was intended to kill the other family members and cover everything up. But for reasons unknown, they were able to escape. Others have posited that the children may have been kidnapped, perhaps unplanned, since they were unexpectedly awake later than usual. And once the fire gained so much attention, the kidnappers murdered them to avoid being caught. In either scenario, the fire would have destroyed any evidence pointing towards murder or kidnapping. The Sodder parents were suspects themselves for a while, but their relentless search for answers quickly proved their own innocence. So that leaves only one other possibility. They were removed from the property by someone else. But the hole in that theory is the eldest daughter, Marion, who is asleep on the couch downstairs. If someone tried to kill or remove the children, probably using the front door, it is likely she would have awoken. It seems that if the children did leave the house before the fire, they would have most likely gone willingly, without causing too much of a fuss. If the children didn't die in the fire, though, where did they go? There was initially hope that the children had escaped and were hiding in the surrounding woods, waiting for the fire to burn out. It's possible that they did get to safety and perhaps died from exposure during the cold night. But they likely wouldn't have gone too far, and their bodies would have been found when the property was later searched. It's also unlikely that all five would have chosen to remain in the same place, without one running for help elsewhere or to find the other family members. They were too young to go much further on their own, and it's highly unlikely they chose to run away on the same night a fire started in their home. They were also too young to start the fire themselves, and somehow plot to hide their siblings who may have been unknowing accomplices. In most disappearances, the moment the Italian mafia is brought up as a theory, people let out a sigh and do a dramatic eye roll. It's true, the Italian mafia explanation is probably one of the most overused explanations to back up outlandish theories in unsolved true crime cases. But in this case, there is some evidence that it could have happened. Whether it was a planned murder, arson, kidnapping, a ransom plot gone awry, it does have some characteristics of a mafia hit. George Sodder had enemies in the Italian community, had been threatened on previous occasions, and there was evidence the family was being tailed by potential mafia members. The elements of an official cover-up are also present, and it's evident that some officials were biased with personal interest in the outcome of the case. So where does that leave us? I think with an intriguing holiday mystery that defies a single explanation. Countless people have tried, but no one has been able to push a single theory that answers all of the unknown questions. If the Sodder fire had happened today, could probably get to the bottom of the case quite quickly. New advances in fire investigation, forensics, and surveillance could probably stir up an explanation without too much trouble. But in 1945, there were enough holes in every theory to make this case endure for decades, even beyond the deaths of the surviving family members. Perhaps what makes this mystery even more intriguing is that there is no indication it will ever be solved. All of the witnesses are gone. Any of the potential surviving Sodder children are likely now deceased, and evidence from the night of the fire no longer exists. This is a mystery that will likely continue as a mystery until the story itself finally burns out. Thank you so much for joining us for this special episode of Haunted Talks, and for making this past year one to remember. We're so grateful to everyone who tuned in, joined us on tour, or shared their love of ghost stories and the unexplained. It's because of you we're able to do what we do. For information about tickets, schedules, or gift certificates, please visit hauntedwalk.com. Special thanks to our Haunted Talks team, including Brittany Buss, who researched and wrote this episode, and Michelle Dennis, our phenomenal audio editor. Your hard work and talent continue to bring these stories to life. We'd love to stay connected with you during the holiday season. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, all at Haunted Walk, for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and plenty of spooky fun. Until we meet again in 2025, sweet dreams and happy haunted holidays.
Good.